Well, can I just first of all say welcome and thank you for joining us as we come together to try and reflect both on what we've learned from the last few months of this worldwide pandemic and also perhaps some of the issues that we think we might face as we seek to find our way forward. And I think I would want to say from the outset that I don't see this at all as a presentation being offered by an expert who's got everything worked out, but very much beginning a conversation that we will need to have in contexts like this one, where leaders of different churches come together to share their stories and their experiences, but also perhaps a conversation that we're going to need to take forward, perhaps coming together as leadership teams in our local churches, or maybe in small groups, or talking through with some of the leaders of some of our local church activities as we begin to try and think together about what we've learned and where we are going. And so what I hope that you might find in this presentation is a framework to help you have that conversation, a conversation that we can begin today, but also something that you can take away and use as you have that conversation in other places. And the first thing I want to say is that I do think we have some precedent here because Jesus himself talks in the Gospels about the need to sit down and look to the future and think about what that might involve. And we find some of those words in Luke chapter 14. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? And if he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Now, I realize that Jesus is talking here primarily about the cost of discipleship, but he does draw on this idea that as normal human beings, we need to be those who look to the future and think about what might be involved in where it is we're going. And of course, the king and the tower builder in these two illustrations do have a great deal in common. But I think it's interesting to just maybe take a moment and think about the contrast between the two of them, because I think there may be some helpful lessons for us to reflect on there. In the case of the tower builder, there is a very clear endpoint in sight, and the challenge really is to sit down and say, okay, this is where I need to be. Now, what is it I need in order to get there? In the case of the king, it's almost turning things around and saying, look, these are the resources that I've got. Now, do I actually need to curtail my plans? Do I need to find a different way of getting to where I need to be, taking account of the resources that are at my disposal? And I think as leaders, that tension is something we all need to inhabit, so to speak. There will be times when our task very much is saying, look, this is where we need to be. Now, this is what we need to do in order to get there. And there may be times when we may be saying, look, this might be what we would want, but let's be realistic about the resources that we've got, and let's maybe curtail our plans a little bit to fit those resources. And I think it's interesting too to just notice for a minute the impact of this. In the case of the tower builder, it's very much saying, look, what is this going to say to the people around you? And again, I think as we look to the future, one of the questions we've got to ask is, well, what is the world out there going to see when they look to us as the local church? What is the message that we want to be sending out? And again, in the case of the king, it's not so much public perception that's the issue, but just the well-being of the kingdom. So again, to some degree, to what degree do we need to just be thinking about how do we sustain the church? How do we make sure that we keep the church in the state that it needs to be as we go forward? So I think in this illustration, there's not only a kind of precedent for the kind of conversation that we're having at the moment, but also maybe some pointers onto some of the aspects that conversation can include. And so we're going to try and look at this in two sessions together. The first of which I've called What Can You See? And this is very much trying to look at the land as we see it now, trying to perhaps look back on some of the experiences that we've had and what we can learn from that. And then in the second session, particularly try and look forward a little bit more, although again, there's a fair amount of overlap there. And I think one of the things that I would want to say is that probably an awful lot of what we have done, what we have achieved in the last 9 months has, if you like, been reactive. I still tell the story, and forgive me for those of you that have heard it before, but I still remember standing up at Latchford Baptist Church. I think it was the 16th of March last year, making this slight joke in the service, saying, well, make the most of this because you might not be here next week. Not really taking myself that seriously. And yet by the following Sunday, I was in this study, which is now obviously the broadcast center for me on Sunday mornings. And my life had changed that dramatically, that quickly. I remember the day, the cancellation day. I don't know whether any of you had this, but I just literally went through my online diary and just clicked delete, 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 as all these meetings disappeared. And imagine that I was going into some fantastic life of utter peace, quiet, and tranquility. But the point I want to make is that actually, for most of us, leadership has been about reacting for the last 9 months, reacting to changes, reacting to anticipated lockdown. But it feels to me as if as we go forward, we need to recognize the fact that we cannot simply take for granted everything that is going to happen around us. People have spoken and said, you know, the changes of values, the different attitudes people have had, it's going to be a wonderful world that we emerge into. But it's been interesting, even in the last 9 months, to recognize that that is not as straightforward as we might have thought. Really interesting. I don't know what your street was like, but we did our bit. We used to go out, was it Thursday night, and have our weekly clap for the NHS, and all the neighbours waved to each other, and we checked everybody was okay, and it was a pleasant summer evening for 10 minutes, and then we all went back inside. When we went out to clap for Major Tom or Captain Tom, we were the only people out there, and we ended up not clapping because we thought we'd look a bit silly. And it was interesting to see how the mood had changed. If some of you may have seen the interview I did with Gary Seradamine a couple of weeks ago, when he was talking about the abuse that is being faced by supermarket workers. And so, although we've seen really positive signs, we have to be honest and say we've also seen that not everything stays where we might want it to be. And this is a quote that I picked up as I was reflecting and thinking about the future, that avoiding fatalism requires leadership. That actually we need, as we go forward, whether we're thinking about our own church, whether we're thinking about our community, we need to be those who are not simply sitting back expecting things to happen, but are beginning to think about how we lead things forward. And as I was looking and thinking about today, I actually found myself looking back, and you might recognize the graphics if you watched it, to something that I put together in the naive days of June, July last year, when we all imagined that, you know, if you might remember my wonderful pastoral letter saying, well, let's make sure that we really rest in August, because we're really going to need to get full back in swing in September, and the world is gonna start again. And of course, how wrong I was. But I put together a little video at that point based on 4 of the sayings of Jesus in Luke's gospel. And I actually, as I looked at it again in preparation for today, although time has moved on, I thought actually there's a lot in that is probably still very valid. And so if you have a look in the chat box, you'll notice that I've put a YouTube address into the chat box. And if you want to find that video, it's just about a 12-15 minute video that goes through some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But essentially what we're trying to do in that is to look at these four stories or four sayings, parables perhaps, of Jesus. The first of which is in Matthew 6, when basically Jesus is saying, well, I honed in on it for seek first the kingdom of God. But Jesus goes on to say, look at the lilies of the field, look at the birds of the air. They don't spin, they don't sow, but that your heavenly Father looks after them. And when I was talking about that with some leaders on Merseyside, one of the key messages that came out of that is to be a church that inhabits today. And it does seem to me that there's something important for us in that perhaps we've lived in an environment for the last 20 years or so where the influence of businesses, you have to have a strategy, you have to have a plan, you have to have your goals, you have to have your targets, you have to know where you're going. And I think, one of the things that we've realized is those who are well equipped, those who are able to inhabit the moment, have been those who have been able to adapt well. And it does strike me that if there's one thing that we are certain about over the next 12 months, it's that there's going to be uncertainty, that there are things that we're not going to be able to predict. So we need to be a church that is able to inhabit the moment and perhaps be prepared, be geared up to give permission to be those who react to what's in front of us rather than have very fixed and very firm plans. And for some people, that will be tremendously liberating. For other people, that will be quite a challenge. And the second story is the story of the pearl merchant. And it strikes me that although this is immensely similar to the story of the widow and the story of the field buyer, which are the other two that I'm going to talk about, the thing about the pearl merchant was that he'd always been a pearl merchant. He found the thing that he'd always been looking for. The pearl he found was so good that every other pearl he'd ever owned was worth getting rid of. And it strikes me that perhaps for some of us, what we have experienced in the last 9 months is, this is what we've always wanted. This is that there are some things that we've done that feel like that pearl of great price. We've actually made connections, or we deepened relationships. So for some of us, we may be able to identify with that and think, yeah, there are aspects of the journey that resonate with the story of the pearl merchant. Then there's the story of the woman who loses the coin. And it's very much for her that there's something missing that she has to find. We imagine it belongs to a set. And so really, without this, we've lost almost everything. And of course, again, for some of us, we will immediately resonate with this. There are things that we are looking at the moment and say, we've lost that. But again, there's two sides to that coin. Sorry, no pun intended. One side of that coin is perhaps during the last 9 months, we have said, we've found something we'd lost. Sorry, this is automatically clicking on. We've found something we've lost and we need to keep hold of it. Or it may be that right now we're very conscious of something that we've lost, and we're saying we need to make sure that we don't, we get that back. We need to reclaim what we've lost. And then there is the guy who digs in the field. And of course, the thing about the guy digging in the field is we have no idea why he was digging in the field, but he just finds something that he never knew was there. But he finds it and he recognizes that because it is of such value, it's worth making the change. It's worth taking possession of the field. And again, whether it's relationships in the community, whether it's new technologies, there are many of us can look back over the last 9 months and say, well, we've found some treasure in the field. We've found new things. We've stumbled across new opportunities. And perhaps as we look to the future, we need to take ownership of what we discover. But I want to pause on that slide for a moment, because I hope that as you look at it, you could immediately, and sort of looking at your little boxes, I can see lots of people pulling pens out and writing things down, which is hugely reassuring, because I can convince myself that you're taking notes, although I realize you could just be doing your emails. But what is interesting is, I guess, that most of us would be able to write 2 or 3 things down in response to that screen. But I also want to suggest to you that that would also be true of probably every member of your congregation. And what is interesting is that you might discover that they've written some very different things down. So, you know, for example, taking ownership of what we discover is, I've found this wonderful church in America online. So why would I ever go back to the one that I used to go to on the corner of my street? Or perhaps not that extreme, but I think we need to recognize the fact that different people will be bringing different narratives and different experiences into whatever we are as we go forward. But it does seem to me that in the light of that, we need to be a church that is flexible and able to respond. And actually, I think for many of us, we've shown ourselves to be a church that is flexible and able to respond. And again, looking around some of you that I've spoken to over the last few months, that's different stories. Some of you that are very much engaged with some of the material that we've offered through NWBA, others of you who've quite rightly produced some of this stuff yourself. In some cases, we've then nicked it and used it ourselves. But we've shown ourselves to be able to do that. But equally, I think as we look forward, how do we continue to be a church that can inhabit today, that is flexible and able to respond? How are we a church that reclaims its heritage? And again, I think this comes back to the finding what we'd lost. Perhaps we have learned that we need some new emphases. Interesting, again, I had a conversation yesterday morning with a regular gathering of ministers on Merseyside, and one of the messages that was resonating in that was actually, you know, that old-fashioned, if you like, if that's the right word to use, call to proclaim the gospel, to share that message of Jesus. Perhaps we'd lost that in the last 10 years or so. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case for all of us, but what is it that as we move forward, whether it's because the pandemic has taken it from us, or whether it's because the pandemic has helped us to re-realize it, a church that reclaims its heritage, a church that recognizes new discoveries. Again, whether that's things we've discovered within the church, and again, I mean, one of the conversations that I've had is, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, how the change of technology, the change of media has brought different people within the church community to the fore, as well as new partnerships within our communities. And we need to be a church that is prepared to invest in what matters. And again, I think this is going to be one of the challenges. I'll say a bit more about this again in a moment. But I think there will be those who are going to expect us to do all kinds of new things, or carry on doing all the things that we always did. But woe betide us if we don't also restart everything that we used to do. And as a leader, I find that prospect quite terrifying. But I do think it's one of the things that we might face as we go forward. So how are we going to learn to invest in what really matters? So I want to offer you a couple of questions, and I'm just going to give us 5 minutes just to think about these questions on our own, first of all. And again, these are probably going to form a lot of what you maybe talk about when you go back into groups. What have you discovered in the last 9 months that you don't want to lose? If leadership is not just about fatalism, we mustn't take for granted that we won't lose them. So what have you discovered, either because of new things or because of perhaps having the time to remember some of the things that we'd got out of sight? What have you discovered that you don't want to lose? And what have you lost? that you want to re-find? So I'm just going to give you 5 minutes on your own, just to inhabit those couple of questions. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance just to begin to gather your own thoughts. And I want to offer you just maybe a way of helping you map something of what might be in front of us. If you find this helpful, again, you might want to just sort of sketch it out yourself as we go. Equally, if it doesn't work for you, then there may be other ways that you can do that. But this is just something that again, as I reflect on reality as we face it at the moment, this question, what can you see? What have you experienced? And maybe those 4 parables of the kingdom as a way of helping you do that. A lot of that, first of all, is going to be around the person that you are. So, as you think about your answers to those questions, as you think about the future, there are going to be certain things that are simply who you are as a person. And again, I guess that many of us in the last 9 months have been on our own personal journey. And for some of us, that may be deeply related to our leadership in the church. To others of us, it may not. In fact, some of us may have been through separation from family or whatever it may be and thought, I'm not sure I want to spend as much time in the church when we come back after this, because I've realized that other relationships matter and other relationships need to be thought about. And again, it's interesting to come back to those words of Jesus where he recognizes the tension of discipleship and sometimes even our family ties. And so I think we need to recognize that we will not be coming back into whatever the new future is unchanged. We will have learned new skills. We will have our own new ideas. We will have our own needs. And every one of us, I'm sure, have got our own story. There are those of us I know in this gathering who have been bereaved through COVID. There are those of us in this gathering who have close family members who are key workers. There are those who've experienced homeschooling. There are teachers who've had to hugely change the way they work. There are those of us who've got parents in care homes that we haven't seen for almost a year. So we will be bringing our own personal reality. We will not be the person we were 9 months ago. And yet, dare I say, for many people, their expectation of us will be that we're just going to carry on where we left off, that we will emerge from this unscathed and ready to go. That may or may not be true. But at the point I want to make is that, again, you need to focus on your own well-being. And very often, particularly in church leadership, often our own well-being is the last well-being that we think about. But there are then, I think, as I mentioned earlier, going to be expectations upon us. And already, I think for many, the conversations that I've had with people are very much around the fact that my personal view for where we need to go now, my aspirations, my vision are already, I'm beginning to recognize, in conflict with some of the expectations that others are placing on me. So again, as I ask you this question with the binoculars on the screen, so to speak, maybe this area of your piece of paper, if you wanted to divide it into 4, you may think, well, okay, how have I changed? But then also, what expectations am I already aware of? Some of those may be conflicting expectations. But what are the expectations? I was talking to a group of leaders a little while ago, and one of them said that a member of the church had said, "Oh, some of us have been meeting together and we've made plans." And they were saying, that we don't even know what those plans are. But clearly there's a group of people coming in with very strong expectations. So what expectations are you already aware of, or perhaps think may be there, or imagine may be there. But interestingly as well, there are going to be needs. And I deliberately separate those out because I think sometimes people's needs and people's expectations can be different. But what are the needs that you imagine are existing at the moment? And again, they could be your personal needs. They could be the needs of the church. They could be the needs of the wider community. And again, one of the questions that we might want to wrestle with is, how do we define ourselves as God's people? And again, realizing that we're in very many different contexts here. Those of us in chaplaincy, the needs that we are confronting now, perhaps we are hoping for a lessening of need, or perhaps there are needs that are being stored up at the moment that we know we're going to have to address. And then I guess that most of us already are beginning to form something of a vision of what we think the future might be or should be. So again, I just kind of want to offer you this as a way of perhaps beginning to map your thoughts. What have you been through? What are you feeling right now? What insights have you got? What expectations either do you know are being placed upon you, or do you fear or look forward to? Let's not be negative about this. There could be expectations that you're relishing. What are the needs that you imagine yourself having to address, be confronted with? And what is the vision that you have, or that you believe the church has for its future? And I'm offering you this really as a map to take into your small groups again, to maybe, hopefully you find this helpful as a way of just mapping out your thinking. Because really what I want us to do is to try and again capture this sense, this very simple question: what can you see? What is it that we see? What are we bringing with us this morning from our best shot at where we are right now? So we're going to go back into those rooms. We're going to leave you in those rooms for about 20, 25 minutes. Hopefully there's enough in what I've just said to begin a conversation as we just try and work out together, what is it that we see as we look to the present, as we look to the future, as we look at our own experiences.